Russian forces have had to resort to some desperate and out-of-the-ordinary measures in recent times. Vladimir Putin's soldiers have been seen riding into battle on horseback, for example, or digging rusty, rotting old armor out of decades-old Soviet-era storage facilities to deploy in frontline firefights. But this latest tactic from the Kremlin's commanders may be just one of the most bizarre moves yet, as Russia is now ripping missiles from its own vehicles, and the reason why is almost too ridiculous to believe. This strange story comes courtesy of the open source intelligence analyst community, which regularly inspects and monitors open source media, like satellite images of Russian military bases, to keep the world informed about the Kremlin's movement. One particular open source intelligence specialist, who goes by the name Jompy on X, shared some fascinating findings after keeping a close eye on the Muromteplovoz factory, which is situated in Russia's Vladimir region, around 160 miles east of Moscow. The factory has historically been involved in the transportation and security sectors, and it's also been used as a storage site for numerous Soviet-era MTLB chassis. The MTLB is a multi-purpose and fully amphibious tracked armored fighting vehicle that first entered service in the 1970s. At that time, it was a relatively revolutionary vehicle, looking and feeling in many ways like a main battle tank, but without quite the same levels of armor and firepower. It was cheap to build too, since large parts of its design were based on existing components, like the YA-MZ238 V8 diesel engine, which was already in use in Soviet trucks of the era. That engine gave the MTLB an operational range of 310 miles and a peak speed of 38 miles per hour on the road and 19 miles per hour off-road. Plus, since it's an amphibious vehicle, it also had the capacity to travel through water, traversing rivers and even lakes at speeds of up to 3.7 miles per hour. Measuring up at over 20 feet in length and more than 9 feet in width, the MTLB also provided plenty of interior space. The crew, made up of a driver and commander or gunner, sat at the front in their own compartment, with the engine separating them. A separate and significantly larger rear compartment also exists, providing space for up to 11 infantry or around 4,400 pounds of cargo. The MTLB also has enough horsepower to tow a load of up to 14,300 pounds. As far as armaments are concerned, this armored fighting vehicle can be fitted out with an array of main guns, including a 12.7mm NSV Cord heavy machine gun, a 30mm AGS-17D AGS-30 automatic grenade launcher, or a 30mm 2A42 2A72 autocannon, plus a small 360-degree turret with a PKT machine gun and 2,500 rounds. Numerous variants of the MTLB have been produced over the years, with many sold and shipped out to other armed forces around the world. East Germany, for example, once used MTLBs, and some were also sent to Bulgaria, Iraq, Poland, Vietnam, Ukraine, Finland, Myanmar, and numerous other nations across the globe. In Russia, one of the most significant uses of the MTLB in the past has been as a launch platform for the Sturm missile system. Also developed during the days of the Soviet Union, the 9K-114 Sturm is a radio-guided anti-tank missile system, also known under the NATO reporting name 86 Spiral. It uses the 9M114 Kokon or Cocoon missile, which was first tested back in 1974 and entered service 2 years later, in 76. Similar in functionality and role to Western anti-tank missiles like the American TOW and the French HOT, the Cocoon boasted impressive speed and versatility at the time of its release, with a maximum range of just over 3 miles and a peak speed of 770 miles per hour, which is effectively the same as the speed of sound. It's able to be deployed from a variety of platforms, including the Mi-24V helicopter gunship and the aforementioned MTLB, with the Sturm system essentially mounted on top of the MTLB chassis, effectively filling the space where the crew compartment would usually be. Equipped with a single-round, retractable pedestal launcher and an automatic loader, the Sturm has in the past proven to be an effective and powerful piece of anti-tank weaponry. Given that Ukraine has an impressive collection of Western tanks, Soviet tanks and other armor in its arsenal, it might have seemed logical for the Russians to repair and revamp some of their old MTLB units and roll them out with fresh missiles on their backs, ready to do battle with Ukrainian armor along the front lines. But that's not what they're doing. According to Jompy and other analysts, the evidence seen at the factory in the Vladimir region actually suggests that Russia is instead removing any trace of missile systems from these old pieces of armor and refurbishing them for a very different and much more basic purpose. In an October 12 tweet, Jompy wrote, "Something interesting with regard to stored MTLBs. Muromteplovoz Zavod, the factory in charge of refurbing these armored vehicles, has finally seen some movement at its yards after many years." In follow-up tweets, Jompy explained, "Looks like the depletion of useful MTLB hulls is forcing them to refurb 9P149 Sturm S-80 GM carriers, which are a big share of the remaining MTLB hulls in storage. It could be to refurb them, turn them into average MTLBs, or even, as far-fetched as it may be, to modernize them to MGT-LBs, as Russia unveiled earlier this year that they plan to produce these to replace their ancient MTLB fleet." As Jompy notes, a lot of the old MTLBs in storage at the factory are the 9P149 Sturm S variants, and it seems that Russia's most likely plan is to effectively remove the offensive capabilities of these vehicles and transform them from deadly anti-tank missile launchers into little more than makeshift troop carriers. To do this, they'll likely remove the missile launcher sections and top covers of the crew compartments, creating additional interior space for soldiers to sit in as they travel from place to place. If that's the case, then there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from this. For one, the very fact that Russia is even looking at old and relatively outdated vehicles like the MTLB shows how desperate it is at the moment. It suffered catastrophic numbers of equipment losses, with the open source analysis group Oryx recording more than 4,190 destroyed tanks and around 8,450 armored and infantry fighting vehicles so far, plus 693 armored personnel carriers and thousands of additional vehicles of various kinds. Evidently, these losses have taken a major toll, as this certainly isn't the first time evidence has emerged of Russian troops being ordered to dig through old storage facilities or drag rusty Soviet-era equipment out of retirement. Indeed, there have been many cases this year alone of Russia rolling out ancient tanks like the T-72A, which dates back to the days of the Cold War, and the even older T-62, which entered service over 60 years ago. This is just the latest example of the Kremlin turning to age-old equipment in a desperate, humiliating attempt to maintain pressure on its opponents along the front lines. This indicates that Russia must be running low on its more modern armored vehicles and personnel carriers, like BMPs and BTRs, and would rather refurb older, weaker and slow alternatives rather than spend time, money and resources making newer ones. The second big takeaway from this story is what it tells us about the Kremlin's commanders' priorities. The Russian army has, historically, prioritized strength and firepower above all else. It's produced and deployed some of the world's toughest tanks and most powerful missile systems, and throughout the war with Ukraine so far, Russia has largely focused on a brute force approach, relying heavily on tanks and armor in the early stages of the war in an attempt to overwhelm its opposition, later transitioning more towards drones and missiles to deal the bulk of its damage. For large parts of the war, Russia didn't appear particularly fearful of Ukraine's counterattack capacities. It was entirely focused on its own offensive maneuvers, confident that it had the stronger and more devastating force and that there was nothing Ukraine could do to stop its relentless advance. However, times have changed. Now, instead of enhancing their offensive capacities with anti-tank missile systems, Russian commanders preferred to make troop carriers. That's because they're finding it harder and harder to actually keep troops alive, get them to critical frontline positions, and mount meaningful offensives due to Ukraine's increasingly effective and deadly drone operators. In highly contested areas of the front, like the Pokros sector in Donetsk, for example, Russia has amassed a massive force, with some estimates suggesting up to 110,000 troops in total, as it desperately attempts to capture this strategic industrial city. But so far, it's failing. Despite deploying artillery, tanks, huge squadrons of soldiers, and even small units in disguise, it's made almost zero headway in the area, and Ukraine's defenders continue to hold the line. There, Ukrainian drones regularly scour the skies, scanning the ground for any signs of life before striking down at their enemies, wiping out one unit after another. As such, Russia has been forced to find new, innovative ways to protect its troops and help them cover long distances in relative safety. It's the only way they have of any chance of actually getting meaningful numbers of soldiers into close proximity of cities like Pokrovsk, and it's the only way they'll likely ever be able to capture that city and others like it. To do that, they need personnel carriers, and since so many have already been blown up or destroyed, they're turning to older models like these MTLBs. It's a sign of a dramatic shift in the Kremlin's military doctrines, a shifting focus from firepower to survivability. As for whether or not it will actually prove to be an effective strategy, only time will tell. Since they're lighter than certain modern infantry fighting vehicles, converted MTLBs may actually prove easier to conceal or disperse in challenging frontline areas, perhaps allowing Russia to move troops into important areas more efficiently than before. At the same time, the MTLB has not exactly proven to be an invulnerable element of the Russian arsenal in the war so far. According to Jompy, Russia began the war with around 3,300 MTLBs in service and has since lost a whopping 1,800 of them. That shows how easy Ukraine has found it to destroy these vehicles, either through drones or other means like missiles, mines and artillery strikes. As such, Kyiv's defenders are likely to be fearful of a few more MTLBs rolling down frontline roads. Another important factor to consider about the Kremlin's cannibalization of these old vehicles is the economic aspect. Right now, it's no exaggeration to say that the Russian economy is in a state of absolute chaos. The country has slowly but surely felt the strain of Western sanctions as the war has progressed, with numerous nations imposing harsh financial penalties on Russian banks, businesses, and oligarchs. Many countries have also minimized their investments in Russia, with plenty of them dramatically reducing the amount of Russian oil, gas, and other fossil fuels they purchase. The Kremlin has attempted to counteract these losses by turning to other nations like India, China, and Turkey to purchase more of its oil. It's also spent time prior to the 2022 invasion building up a significant war chest and taking other measures to proactively protect its economy from sanctions and losses. However, the longer the war has gone on, the worse the situation has become. And now, even Putin's massive war chest is running low, while his country faces very high inflation, unprecedented labor shortages, rising interest rates, and an increasingly unhappy population, struggling with the rising cost of living. Amidst all that, it's naturally becoming harder and harder for Russia to maintain its high levels of defense spending and investment, and it may be that the Kremlin simply cannot afford to make new modern infantry fighting vehicles and armored personal carriers, opting instead for the much cheaper option of retrofitting older pieces of hardware like the MTLBs. It's also likely that the country's military production plants are already under intense strain and perhaps have more pressing priorities like manufacturing drone components, missiles, artillery shells and ammunition to make up for all that's been used, lost or destroyed in Ukrainian drone strikes in recent weeks and months. With open source analysis indicating that Russia has reactivated roughly 2,500 older MTLBs since the war began, and with around 480 more believed to remain in storage, the country certainly has no shortage of these vehicles and is unlikely to run out of them anytime soon. Thus, in many ways, there's a logical choice to help fill gaps in the Russian arsenal and provide at least some level of safety to troops as they move from point A to B. Kremlin engineers are also hard at work at developing the MTLB successor, the MGT-LB, a light multi-purpose tractor transporter designed to meet the needs and conditions of modern military operations. Capable of transporting personnel, ammunition and other equipment, and flexible enough to work with a variety of weapons and specialized hardware, the MGT-LB should bring numerous advantages over its predecessor. And it seems that Russia intends to use the aforementioned Muromteplovoz factory to produce these new vehicles. In an additional tweet, Jompy explained, "Finally, and as is also happening with most of the Russian military industry, Muromteplovoz Zavod is also being rebuilt, renovated and expanded to increase its capabilities, probably related to future MGT-LB production. Previously, this factory looked so run down." So, the Kremlin appears to have at least long-term plans in place to upgrade its troop carrying capacities. But, for the time being, until its economy strengthens and it can begin mass production of more modern infantry vehicles, it'll have to make do with these refurbished MTLBs, which are little more than cheap and simple stopgaps. And while any troops that climb on board may at least have a slightly better chance of surviving drone-infested areas compared to those that have been forced to travel on foot or aboard simple civilian vehicles, they're still not likely to enjoy much protection. In short, while the Kremlin might like to paint this move as a sign of creativity or even ingenuity, it is in actual fact little more than another display of desperation, a sign of how weak the once mighty Russian army has become, forced to dig through decades-old storage units and deploy vehicles whose best days are long behind them. And this isn't the only example of Russia having to make do with vehicles that are way past their sell-by date. Only days ago, on October 12, official Russian documents fell into the hands of the open-source intelligence group Frontelligence Insight, revealing the Kremlin's secret plans to refurbish and upgrade more than 800 of its old T-72 main battle tanks. The documents in question originally came from the state-owned Russian defense manufacturer Uralvagonzavod and were shared on the Frontelligence Insight website, complete with comments, translations, and detailed breakdowns of all the most important elements. Sifting through the files, the open-source intelligence analysts found that Russia has plans to restore and modernize approximately 828 T-72 tanks by 2036. It will mostly draw these tanks out of old Cold War-era stockpiles, making the necessary upgrades and adjustments to bring them into the 21st century as new and improved T-72B3M configuration models. According to the report, the bulk of these upgrades are scheduled to take place between 2027 and 2029, which suggests that Russia sees the war with Ukraine continuing for at least another few years. During that period, around 498 of the T-72 tanks will receive their upgrades. The leaked documents also show that Russia intends to ramp up production of its more modern tank variants, including the T-90M and T-99M2, planning an increase in production rates of 80% compared to 2024 levels. In some ways, this is an ambitious strategy, affirming the Kremlin's commitment to modernize its arsenal of armor and maintain a strong and stable stock of modern combat-ready tanks. In other ways, this move once more reeks of desperation. It suggests that Russia simply doesn't expect to have the funds or resources necessary to fully commit to making new tanks in the coming years, and so it must instead rely on bringing old units out of retirement and making core changes to bring them up to today's standards. And the fact of the matter is that even with some extra armor plating and other improvements here and there, tanks like these will still be outdated and surpassed by many of their modern rivals. Russia was once one of the world's greatest tank-producing nations and is now starting to be left behind. It's paying the price for its wasteful and unsustainable war with Ukraine in more ways than one, and it's looking increasingly weak on the world stage as well as on the battlefields of Ukraine. Now, learn more about Russia's latest losses in our recent video, exploring how the Kremlin's forces are being repeatedly wiped out along the so-called roads of death that lead in and out of Pokrovsk. Or for a big picture view of just how costly the Kremlin's campaign has been, check out this video detailing the unfathomable number of Russian soldiers who have either been killed or injured so far, and how the Kremlin callously and cold-heartedly attempts to cover up these losses. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can remain informed and up to date on everything that's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts around the world.